You take a sip. Something feels off. Not terrible, not undrinkable, just harsher, a little more bitter than you remember. So, naturally, you blame the coffee. Maybe the company changed the recipe. Maybe the beans aren't as good anymore. Maybe it's just another bag of disappointing supermarket coffee. But here's the strange part. Some of the most bitter cups of coffee have nothing to do with the coffee itself. In fact, one of the biggest causes of bitterness may be happening in your kitchen every single morning. And most coffee drinkers never realize it, because bitterness has one of the biggest image problems in coffee. For decades, people have associated bitterness with strength. If it's bitter, it must be strong. If it's strong, it must be good. At least, that's what many coffee drinkers were taught to believe. But coffee professionals often see it differently, because bitterness is not automatically a sign of quality. Sometimes it's the exact opposite. Sometimes bitterness is a warning sign. A sign that too much was extracted from the coffee. A sign that something went wrong before the first sip. And once you understand that, a lot of frustrating coffee experiences suddenly start making sense. Here's something most people never think about. Coffee is mostly water. More than 98% of the final cup is water. Think about that for a second. People spend years comparing brands' roast prices. Origins, yet the ingredient filling almost the entire cup is usually the one nobody questions. And that's one reason the exact same coffee can taste completely different from one house to another. One person tastes sweetness. Another tastes bitterness. Same coffee. Different result. And that leads to a question most coffee drinkers never ask. If the coffee didn't change, what did? Because bitterness doesn't appear out of nowhere. That something creates it. And one of the biggest causes is something called over-extraction. The term sounds technical. Idea is simply the water pulled out more than it should have. Not just the pleasant flavors, not just the aroma. Everything, including the harsh compounds that make coffee taste bitter. And the surprising part is how easy it is to do. Water that's too hot. Coffee ground too fine. Brewing for too long. Using too much coffee. Small mistakes. Big difference in the cup. And here's where things start getting really interesting. Because one of the most common mistakes isn't made by beginners. It's made by people who've been drinking coffee for years. Take peep to make coffee stronger. More grounds. Darker roasts. Stronger blends. Hotter brewing. But stronger and better are not the same thing. And that's a distinction that changes everything. Because many coffee drinkers spend years chasing strength, when what they actually want is richness. And those are very different things. At this point, it's easy to blame the coffee. But coffee often gets accused of things it didn't actually do. Because bitterness usually doesn't come from a single mistake. It comes from a chain of small ones. And one of the biggest is temperature. Most people never measure the temperature of the water they use. They simply wait for it to boil, then pour. Seems reasonable. The problem is that coffee isn't designed to be brewed with boiling water. In fact, many coffee professionals recommend brewing somewhere around 90 degrees Celsius to 96 degrees Celsius, 195 degrees Fahrenheit to 205 degrees Fahrenheit, closing parenthesis. Above that range, the extraction becomes far more aggressive and aggressive. Extraction often means one thing: more bitterness. That's why 2 cups made from the exact same coffee can taste completely different. One feels balanced, the other feels harsh. The coffee didn't change. The water did. And this is where many people accidentally create a stronger-looking coffee that actually tastes worse, because when bitterness increases, the brain often interprets it as strength, even when the overall experience becomes less enjoyable. And temperature isn't the only hidden factor. Grinding matters too. A lot. Imagine pouring water through pebbles. The water moves quickly. Now imagine pouring water through sand. Everything slows down. Coffee works the same way. The finer the grind, the harder the water has to work its way through, which means more extraction. And if extraction goes too far, bitterness starts taking over. That's why a coffee that tasted great last month can suddenly taste terrible after changing grinders, or after buying pre-ground coffee from a different source. Same coffee, different grind, completely different cup. And here's something many coffee drinkers never hear. Bitterness and strength are not synonyms. A coffee can be rich, full-bodied, flavorful with it being bitter. In fact, some of the most respected coffees in the world are admired for sweetness and balance rather than bitterness. But supermarket coffee created a different expectation over the years. People became used to associating darkness equals strength, bitterness equals quality, stronger equals better, and once those ideas become habits, they can be difficult to question, especially after decades. But here's where things get even more surprising. The coffee itself may not be the freshest part of the equation anymore. Think about what happens after opening a bag. Day 1. The aroma is everywhere. The kitchen smells amazing. The coffee feels alive. Then a week passes, maybe 2. The aroma weakens. The flavor becomes flatter. And what often remains most noticeable? Bitterness. Because the delicate compounds disappear first, the pleasant aromas, the sweetness, the complexity, those fade long before bitterness does. That's why older coffee often tastes harsher, not because bitterness increased, because everything else decreased. And once that happens, bitterness dominates the experience. This is also why many people think so metiams. It did. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the coffee simply lost the characteristics that were balancing the bitterness in the first place. And here's another mistake that's hiding in plain sight. Coffee makers. Not all coffee makers brew equally. Some brew too hot. Some brew too slowly. Some fail to maintain stable temperature. And over time, mineral buildup inside machines can make the problem even worse, especially in areas with hard water. That's one reason coffee can slowly become less enjoyable over months, without people realizing why. Nothing dramatic happened. The changes were gradual, and gradual problems are the hardest to notice, because people adapt. They keep drinking the coffee, keep buying the same brand, keep following the same routine. The cup quietly gets worse. And then one day they reach a conclusion. This coffee isn't as good as it used to be. Sometimes they're right, but not always. Because the coffee may not be the thing that changed. The brewing process may have changed first, and once you start looking at bitterness through that lens, something becomes obvious. A surprising amount of coffee frustration has very little to do with coffee brands, and a lot to do with everything surrounding them. But there is still one major factor we haven't talked about yet: Because even when the water is right, even when the grind is right, even when the brewing is right, some coffees naturally taste far more bitter than others. And the reason why explains one of the biggest misconceptions in the entire coffee industry. Walk through almost any coffee aisle today. You'll see the same promises everywhere. Bold, bold, extra. Bold, dark roast, maximum flavor, rich, and intense. After seeing those words for years, it's easy to believe stronger coffee must be better coffee. And honestly,
That?
exactly what many coffee drinkers started believing when coffee tasted weak. They bought darker coffee. When coffee felt boring, they bought stronger coffee. When coffee seemed flat, they added more grounds. The solution always seemed to be the same. More. Roast. More bitterness. More intensity. But here's the strange part. The coffee industry spent decades teaching people to chase strength, while many coffee drinkers were actually looking for something completely different. Flavored, because strength and flavor are not the same thing. And once people discover that distinction, their entire relationship with coffee often changes. Think about the best cup of coffee you've had recently. Not the strongest one. The one you genuinely enjoyed. The one you wanted to drink again. The next morning, there's a good chance it wasn't memorable because it was bitter. It was memorable because it was balanced. Because balance is what keeps people coming back, not intensity. That's why some long-time coffee drinkers eventually make a surprising move. They stop going darker and start going lighter. Not light roast necessarily, just less extreme medium roasts, balanced blends. Coffees that still allow aroma, sweetness, and body to exist together. And that's often where people rediscover something they haven't experienced in years. Coffee that actually tastes like coffee. Not just roast. Not just bitterness. Coffee. And once that happens, another realization follows. Many coffee frustrations weren't caused by buying the wrong coffee. They were caused by chasing the wrong goal. For years, the goal was, make it stronger. But stronger isn't always better. Steak can be overcooked. Music can be too loud. Perfume can be too strong. And coffee can absolutely become too bitter. That's the part many people never hear, because bitterness is easy to create. Good flavor is harder. Good flavor requires balance, freshness, proper brewing, water temperature, the right grind size, and sometimes simply getting out of the habit of thinking bitter means better. Because one of the biggest myths in coffee is that harshness equals quality. It doesn't. A great cup of coffee should make you want another sip, not make you reach for sugar to fix it. And that's why some people spend years switching brands. Without solving the real problem, the brand changes. The bitterness stays, because the cause never changed. The brewing stayed the same. The water stayed the same. The habit stayed the same. And once people understand that, they stop chasing stronger coffee. They start chasing better coffee. And those are completely different journeys. So if your coffee has been tasting more bitter lately, before blaming the brand, before buying a more expensive bag, before jumping to an even darker roast, look at everything surrounding the coffee first, because the answer may already be sitting in your kitchen. And once you figure out what's causing that bitterness, coffee becomes enjoyable again. Not because it got stronger, because it finally became balanced.